Hey everybody, welcome to Fulfilled. I'm your host, Rebecca Sheehan. Today's topic is one that, until recently, probably felt distant for a lot of us. That all changed on September 10th when Charlie Kirk, a passionate defender of the Christian faith and conservative values, was assassinated during one of his trademark campus events where he boldly but gently shared the gospel. Ever since his death, martyrdom has been on people's lips and in our hearts, whereas before, at least for me, if I'm being honest, the word mostly brought to mind old medieval paintings of saints. But martyrdom is not a thing of the past. Evil still tries to stamp out the gospel wherever it shines, and every year, thousands of Christians die unwavering in their faith. With this reality now top of mind, it's a powerful moment to hear their stories, pray for the persecuted, and even let their courage draw our own hearts closer to God. As Danish theologian and philosopher Søren Kierkegaard said, "The tyrant dies and his rule is over, the martyr dies and his rule begins." To unpack all of this is Todd Nettleton with Voice of the Martyrs, a nonprofit that supports persecuted Christians around the world with prayer, advocacy, and practical help. Todd is an author, speaker, and host of Voice of the Martyrs Radio, where he shares powerful stories of believers who risk it all for their faith. Todd, so glad to have you on the show today.
Thanks so much. It's good to be with you.
Could you start by explaining Voice of the Martyrs for anyone who's not familiar, what it is, and of course, the powerful story of how it began?
Sure. Yeah. Voice of the Martyrs is a ministry to persecuted Christians. So we exist to serve Christians in more than 70 countries where following Jesus comes with a cost. It is a regular part of following Jesus to have to pay some price. And sometimes that's you're kicked out of your family. Sometimes it's you lose your job. Sometimes it is you are killed. You lay down your life for the cause of Christ. And so Voice of the Martyrs seeks to serve Christians who are facing that, really to come alongside them and say, hey, what do you need? How can we help you? And then here in the U.S., we tell their stories so that the body of Christ can be connected, so that we can be in fellowship with our brothers and sisters around the world, so that we can support them and help them and pray for them, but also so we can be encouraged. We can be challenged by their stories. And when you hear the story of someone who was willing to die for Christ, suddenly it seems like a lot of what we deal with is inconvenience, not risk, but inconvenience. And the founding of the Voice of the Martyrs was by persecuted Christians. Our founders, Pastor Richard Wurmbrand, his wife Sabina. Richard spent 14 years in prison in communist Romania. Sabina spent 3 years in prison herself. And so when they came to the West, they actually were ransomed out of Romania. It's an interesting story that the going rate for a political prisoner was $1,500. The price to ransom Richard was $10,000. So he was considered a very high-value prisoner. And Christians in the West paid that $10,000 to the communist government. Richard was ransomed out of the country. And before he left, the secret police took him aside. They said, Pastor Wurmbrand, you're going to the West. You can talk about the Bible all you want. You can talk about God all you want, but don't talk about us. Don't talk about what we did to you. Richard came to the West and did exactly what they told him not to do. He began to share the stories of being in prison, the stories of being beaten, and not just saying, hey, I went through this, but saying, hey, there are pastors still in those prisons. There are still Christians who are suffering behind the Iron Curtain. And, Christians like you and I, we hear that and we say, okay, well, how do we help those people? How do we connect with them? That is really why the Voice of the Martyrs was founded, was to be a bridge between the church in hostile areas and restricted nations and the church in the free world like the United States.
So how I heard of Voice of the Martyrs was actually I was sitting in a doctor's office and picked up one of your magazines, and it was this incredible story about a woman in Vietnam who lost her husband. I think he was bludgeoned to death, and then lost her son, was forced to live in a pig pen. I think I was tearing up, and people must have looked at me like I was crazy. But when I researched more and I learned about the Wurmbrands, there's some crazy parallels to my own story because they grew up Jewish, as did I, and my grandparents are from Romania also.
Wow.
And were Holocaust survivors. So they were persecuted during World War II as well. But when it comes to the Wurmbrands, how did they become imprisoned, and Why did they want to keep him there so badly to charge 10,000 for his ransom instead of the going rate of 1,500?
As you say, Richard and Sabina both were from Jewish backgrounds, Jewish families. By the time they found Christ, though, they had sort of left behind Judaism. They were seekers of pleasure. They were seekers of the good life, and we're going to be rich. We're going to have an easy life. And Richard got tuberculosis. He was sent away to the mountains. Supposedly, the clean mountain air would help relieve the pressure in his lungs, and he ended up spending months there. While he was there, he met a man named Christian Wolfkus, who had been praying for years that God would allow him to reach one Jew for Christ. That was kind of his life's mission, and he prayed every day. And his prayer was, Lord, you've given me this passion. Before I die, I want to reach one Jew for you. But Lord, there aren't any Jews in my village, and I'm too old to travel. So you're going to have to bring a Jew to me. And lo and behold, Richard Wurmbrand goes to the mountains to recover from tuberculosis, and he's in the village where Christian Wolfkus is, and they encounter each other. Christian Wolfkus gives him a Bible, sort of plants that seed, and ultimately Richard comes to faith in Christ. He then became a pastor. He was a pastor in the Lutheran Church. He became involved in the National Association of Evangelicals, so he was not just a leader of one church, he was a leader of leaders, and that's why he was considered such an important target. The way he got sort of in the crosshairs of the communists, after the communist takeover of Romania, they held something called the Congress of the Cults, and they invited all of the religious leaders from across the country to come together. And the honorary chairman of this gathering was Joseph Stalin. So they gathered all these religious leaders, and they made a bunch of speeches about how, we communists and you Christians, we can get along. And somebody on the platform said, actually, Jesus was the first communist. His teachings really support communism. And they had different religious leaders that stood up and said, yes, we can get along. Yes, we can serve the communists. Richard and Sabina were sitting there listening to this, their hearts sinking. And Sabina actually looked at Richard and said, you need to go up there and wipe this shame from the face of Christ. And Richard looked at her and said, if I do that, you will no longer have a husband. And Sabina shot back, I do not wish to have a coward for a husband. And that really put steel in Richard's spine. He stood up and went to the front, and they gave him the microphone, and he said, brothers and sisters, our first loyalty is not to any party. Our first loyalty has to be to Jesus Christ. They cut the power to the microphone. Richard had to literally go out the back door and get away. But from that day forward, it was only a matter of time until he was going to be arrested. He was going to pay for his audacity to stand up and say, no, we have to be loyal to Christ first before we're loyal to the government or the party or anything else. And ultimately, he spent 14 years in prison, including 3 years in solitary confinement, literally 3 years without seeing another person. The guards wore pads on their shoes so you couldn't hear them walking around outside. Several years ago, I had the chance to go to Romania. We filmed a small group curriculum based on the lives of Richard and Sabina, and we went to the prison. And I went in one of those solitary confinement cells, and the producer of our videos shut the door. And I have to say, it took about 20 seconds, and I'm like, okay, open the door. Like, let me out of here. I don't want to be in here. And the thought of Richard being there for 3 years is really mind-blowing. And he writes movingly about how things slipped away and fell away. And, one of the things he did early on, he recited the Lord's Prayer faithfully every day. And they were feeding him drugs to numb his mind. And he said by the end, he had lost most of the Lord's Prayer, but he held on to our Father. And he would just repeat, my Father, my Father. And that kept his faith alive, and I think it helped him hang on to his sanity during those long years of torture and suffering and isolation.
I don't think there's any way a human being could hang on to their sanity alone without God's help.
Yeah, it is mind-blowing to think about the suffering that they went through.
What a powerful story. And people who aren't Christians don't think that it's difficult at all. They just think, oh, Christianity is, at least in the West, sort of the default religion. And especially compared to being Jewish at the time with Nazi Germany and everything, oh, being Christian is the easy way out. I love how this story shows that it's not.
Yeah. No, it is definitely not, and that's true today in more than 70 countries around the world. That's not just a story from the 1940s. That's a story from 2025.
So let's talk about Voice of the Martyrs today. Now, first, how did you get involved with it? And then I would love to hear some stories that maybe you've experienced out in the field. I know you wrote a very impactful book on this and interview passionate, amazing people every day. So
I always tell people my involvement at VOM goes back to when I was 12 years old and my family packed up and moved to Papua New Guinea. So I grew up in Southern California, and at 12 years old, my parents became missionaries and we moved to Papua New Guinea. And we had a sort of a family conference before that. We ran around the circle and I was the no vote. It was 3-1. And I was like, nope, I don't want to move to Papua New Guinea. I'm getting ready to go into junior high. I can finally do sports in school. This is just not a good time.
you're like Jonah not wanting to go to
Yeah.
Nineveh, right?
It was like, that's great. But no, I don't want to go. Ultimately, and certainly I agree with this. Like, if the Lord's calling us, we got to go. And so we packed up and moved to Papua New Guinea. And that really started me on the road of what I do today. So I think it started when I was 12 years old. By the time I got hired, I was 28 years old. Voice of the Martyrs was much, much smaller at that point, building a communications department. And they took me out to dinner and said, hey, we need somebody who can write press releases and tell stories. And I said, boy, I love telling stories and I can certainly write a press release. And so that really was the entry point. And now 27 years later, I'm still here. And when we launched the radio program in 2014, I had the opportunity to host that. And it has been such a blessing to encounter so many heroes of the faith and to be able to sit down and ask them questions. And I think of it as like I'm interviewing Paul and Silas after they came out of the jail in Philippi. Like I'm asking, so what was it like in the cell? And what song were you singing? And what was going on in your mind? What was going on in your heart? I get to have those kind of conversations, and it is a incredible divine privilege to be able to do that.
Is there one story that stands out in particular to you that really moved you the most?
There are many, but there's a couple that come to mind. So one is a lady, and I write about her in my book. So I went to China, and they said, hey, we have the chance to interview this lady named Sister Tong. She had spent 6 months in prison for hosting a house church meeting in her home. And at that time, the Chinese government was raiding house church meetings. They would take pictures of everyone. They would write down all your ID documents. But the person who was the host, they went to jail. And she was released like 3 weeks before we were there. And so we got to sit down and I got to interview her. And so I know I'm going to come back to America. I'm going to write this story for the free Voice of the Martyrs magazine. So if you're going to tell a story, the first thing you need is the setting. It was a dark and stormy night. And so I say, Sister Tong, tell me about the prison. And what I'm thinking is like, how hard was the bed? How big were the rats? How terrible was the food? Let's paint a picture of how miserable your life has been during the 6 months that you were in prison. And so the translator translates my question, and Sister Tong gets what I can only describe as a heavenly smile on her face. She says something in Chinese, and the translator says, oh, yes, that was a wonderful time. And I'm very confused at this point. Like I looked at I'm like, are you sure that you asked I was asking about the prison. Are you sure she understood that? And he's like, oh yeah, she understood that. And I'm like, okay, well, you better explain yourself because nobody would call 6 months in a Chinese prison a wonderful time. And so I said, okay, Sister Tong, why was it a wonderful time? And she said, Jesus was so close to me in that prison cell. I got to experience his presence in a way that I never had before. I never had experienced him that close when I was outside of prison. And she said, you know what else? There were some ladies in my cell, and when I got there, they didn't know Jesus, but they know him now. And I got to be the one to share Christ with them and see them accept Christ. So Jesus was with me, and he gave me a ministry to do. So that was a wonderful time. Like how could it not be a wonderful time if I get to experience his presence and if he is giving me a ministry to do? And ever since that conversation, my mind has changed in whatever circumstance I'm in. Is like, is it possible that this could be a wonderful time if Jesus is with me and if Jesus gives me a ministry to do? Is it possible a hospital room could be a wonderful time? Is it possible the unemployment line could be a wonderful time? Is it possible that my car breaks down and I'm in a tow truck, that could be a wonderful time because God is with me and God gives me a ministry to do? So if we look at this situation through her eyes, is it possible this could be a wonderful time? And that's one example. There's another example that comes immediately to my mind of an Iranian Christian that I met out of a Muslim background. And I'm sitting down with him. I'm going to interview him. And he said, "Now, I want you to know I'm a really competitive person." And I'm like, "Oh, well, that's cool." And he's like, "No, I am really a competitive person." And he went on to say, when I was a thief, I wanted to be the best thief in my city. I wanted to steal stuff that other people had tried to steal and failed just to show that I was a better thief than they were. And he said, when I was a drug addict, I wanted to do more drugs than anyone else because I was going to be the best drug addict in my city. And he said, now that I'm a follower of Christ, I want to be the best evangelist that Jesus has ever had. I want to tell every single person that I meet about Christ. So he started out the conversation that way. Like I'm so competitive. I'm going to be the best disciple that Jesus has ever had. But then he talked about how he lives that out. And he ended up in jail, as will happen in Iran when you're being the best disciple that Jesus has ever had and you're evangelizing everywhere you go. But even in jail, God was with him. And so he was in jail for almost a month, eventually was released. And when he sent in his report for his ministry that month to his leadership, he didn't mention that he was in jail. He simply mentioned, I shared Christ with 100 people. 24 of them received Christ and accepted him, and I'm working with them to disciple them. And it was only a couple weeks later that the leaders realized, like, he had been arrested. Like, he was in jail when he shared Christ with 100 people. But he had so many stories of God putting him in the right place at the right time. And his attitude is, if I meet someone, I know the Holy Spirit has prepared them to hear the gospel because I've made that commitment. I'm going to share Christ with every person I meet. And so his expectation everywhere he goes and with anyone he has a conversation with is this person is ready to hear the gospel, because why else would God have brought them across my path? Because I'm going to be the best evangelist Jesus has ever had.
That's incredible. It just really makes me think of Christians here in America. We're just too comfortable, too relaxed in our faith. I was up late last night. I don't feel like going to church this Sunday. Compared to these people in jail who are evangelizing and grateful to be there.
One of the challenges for us as American Christians is typically the gospel that we heard was come to Jesus and he's going to make your life better. Oftentimes it is literally financially or physically better. He's going to heal you from every sickness, and he's going to make sure you're successful in your job. He's going to make sure that you're profitable. So you need to come to Jesus because your life here on earth is going to be better when you walk with Jesus. The gospel message that our brothers and sisters in China or Iran or Nigeria hear is come to Jesus. Your life is going to get worse. It's going to be harder. There's going to be sacrifice. There's going to be pain. But come to Jesus. He will walk with you through that pain and through that sacrifice. And you have the promise of heaven. You have the promise of eternity with him. And so if you've heard the message that your life is going to get better and then you have trouble, it's like, well, wait a minute. Was this not true? Is he not paying attention to me? Did something go wrong? If you've heard the gospel message, your life is going to be harder, but Jesus will be with you. And then trouble comes, you think, oh, yeah, this is what they said was going to happen. But I know Jesus is with me. And so part of our challenge as American Christians is to grab a hold of the gospel that says, you will have sacrifice. Jesus said, the world hates me. And if you follow me, the world is going to hate you. We don't hear that as part of our gospel presentation very often in an American context of, hey, come to Jesus so the world will hate you. Our brothers and sisters in places around the world, they know the reality of that.
The gospel can be so sugar-coated here. I think it's because churches are afraid that people won't come if they're to quote unquote fire and brimstone, but it's such a shame that the gospel is being watered down and that sin isn't being talked about and all these things because you see in these other countries that that is really kind of where the power comes from.
Yeah, it is a loss for us, and frankly, it's one of the ministries of Voice of the Martyrs is to connect brothers and sisters in America with their spiritual family around the world to understand that reality and to hear that side of following Jesus. There is sacrifice, but it is always worth it. Jesus is worthy, whatever the sacrifice may be.
Haven't you said before that the persecuted Christians pray for us here in the West?
They do. They do. They ask us to pray for them, but they do pray for us. They want us to be bold followers of Christ. Just as we pray, they also will be bold followers of Christ where they are.
Is there a perception they have of Christians here?
It depends on where you're at. I'll never forget a conversation with a house church pastor in China. And since then, he's passed away. He's now in heaven. But he said in China, the devil uses persecution to attack the church. He said in America, the devil uses prosperity to attack the church. And they're both weapons and they're both attacks against the church, but the devil will use whatever weapon is available to him. And I thought that was very interesting and I found it a little bit convicting. Like, are we so wrapped up in our prosperity? Are we so wrapped up in our comfort? And are we handing that to the devil as a weapon to use against us? Or are we willing to be uncomfortable? Are we willing to be unprosperous and really focused on the kingdom and focused on the advance of the gospel?
That is incredibly powerful. Just continuing on that line of talking about Christians in America and martyrdom, Charlie Kirk had such a significant impact on Christians here. What are your thoughts on that? Because I mean, it really, I felt in my heart that we were witnessing something monumental and historic, like witnessing a modern martyr here. What impact do you see that as having on Christians here?
I'm very interested to see what happens in the months and even in the years to come. I honestly was not super familiar with Charlie Kirk before that day. Since that time, I have watched some video of him defending biblical principles and often doing it in a winsome way, in a way that showed care for the people he was speaking to. And so one of the things I know has happened is, like me, a lot of people have gone online and watched videos of Charlie. And so, who knows what gospel seeds have been planted through those videos? Who knows how many of those people were asking spiritual questions and eternal questions and thought, "Oh, well, I'm just going to look at what he says." And we don't know how the Lord is going to use this, but I think one of the things I hope happens is American Christians have that concept that it could cost me to follow Jesus Christ. We often think, well, no, I was born in America. I have a blue passport. That's something that happens in Africa or that happens in China. Maybe this is a reminder. What if it cost me to follow Jesus? And most of us, frankly, we're not dealing with the risk of being shot. We're dealing with the risk of having an awkward conversation with our neighbors. Like, when I share the gospel with my neighbors, they might chuckle and they might think I'm a little weird. Okay, yes, that's a sacrifice, but it's not getting shot. It's not someone beating you up. And so I always try to tell American Christians, like, hey, our risk is pretty low. Surely, if our brothers and sisters in China and Iran can risk going to prison and being tortured, we could maybe risk an awkward conversation.
100%. Do you see other examples in places around the world where martyrs have had a powerful impact like that?
We see it in the book of Acts. We see people laying down their lives for Christ, and we're inspired by that. I talked to a gospel worker from China not long ago, and as often happens, as I have conversations on Voice of the Martyrs radio, one of my last questions is, okay, well, how can we pray? And one of the things he said is specifically for China, he said, pray for the young believers who are going through persecution for the first time. It's gotten harder for Christians in China over the last, 3, 4, 5 years. And they have the stories of their grandfathers who did go through persecution, but they haven't lived them. So pray that they'll stand firm, because he said, after you go through persecution and you see, okay, God is faithful, even in a jail cell, even in a courtroom, even in the police station, God is faithful. After you see that the first time, you have a little more confidence. So they are inspired by the stories of their grandfathers, but they also have to live it and see it firsthand. But there is so much power in the stories of our brothers and sisters, and seeing God's faithfulness, and just knowing and being reminded God is faithful. God can carry me through.
It's a great point, just how powerful these stories can be. Speaking of that, there was a viral clip recently of Bill Maher talking about the crisis in Nigeria and how Christians are being killed by the Islamic group Boko Haram, and how nobody's talking about it. There are no news outlets talking about it. Well, except maybe you guys. So,
I was going to
do
say,
you?
somebody's talking about
Yeah,
it.
right. Maybe that's how we heard about it. But do you feel that there is a consistent lack of coverage here in the West of Christian persecution around the world? And then if you could also just share a little bit more about what's happening in Nigeria for anyone who's interested, because there were no news stories about it.
So one of my jobs here at Voice of the Martyrs is media relations. And so I do watch what the media says. I do kind of monitor this. And over the years, I've kind of developed a theory that there's going to be one Christian persecution story per year
A
that
year. Oh
that
my
is going to
gosh.
break through the national conversation, that's going to break through to the secular media. And several years ago, it was the Chibok girls that were kidnapped in Nigeria, and that became a big story. And a couple years later, it was Pastor Andrew Brunson, the American pastor who was arrested in Turkey. Okay, that was the story for that year. And so I don't think that theory is 100% true, but it's close. Like once a year, the secular media is going to talk about a Christian persecution story. But obviously, Voice of the Martyrs, we're talking about it all the time. It's happening all the time. And so, frankly, I celebrate when someone like Bill Maher brings it up, is like people who aren't subscribing to Voice of the Martyrs magazine, but they are watching Bill Maher. They're going to hear about persecuted Christians. The word is going to go out, and who knows what God will do with that seed once it's planted. But as it relates to Nigeria, there is so much violence in the northern part of Nigeria, and Boko Haram is one of the groups. There is another group that is also attacking Christians. It is now spreading across the border into Cameroon, into Niger, and so we are seeing those Christians attacked, and oftentimes they have to flee with only what they can carry. And so Voice of the Martyrs is involved in helping even provide tarps for them to sleep under, provide food to get them through to the next meal, the next day. But more importantly, as Voice of the Martyrs delivers that help, is the message that you're not alone, you're not forgotten, you're part of the body of Christ, and we remember you. We are with you in this time of suffering. And we have worked alongside in northern Nigeria some amazing pastors. I think of one pastor who, it was so unsafe that he sent his family about 6 hours away to be in safety, but he stayed there. And what he said was, if I leave, who's going to shepherd my flock? I need to stay here. So even as he recognized it's not safe enough that I want my wife and children here, but I'm going to stay here because this is where God has called me. That's the kind of courage and the kind of commitment that our persecuted brothers and sisters show us and inspire us with, as they say, no, as long as God has called me here, I'm going to stay here no matter what happens.
What are the reasons for the persecution? I mean, I know that there are probably a variety, but in this case, for example, is it ethnic cleansing? Are they threatened by Christians, or what is it?
Boko Haram wants to set up a caliphate. They want to set up an Islamic nation in northern Nigeria. And so that's part of the reason that Christians are targeted, especially pastors, especially churches, is that gets in the way of setting up their idea of this sort of promised land for Islam, for Muslims. So that's the case in Nigeria. In many cases, it comes down to power. I think of communist China. The Communist Party wants you to wake up as a Chinese citizen every single day and say, okay, my first loyalty is to the Communist Party. What can I do to help them today? As followers of Jesus Christ, our first loyalty is to Jesus Christ. And hopefully we wake up every morning and say, Lord, what can I do to serve you today? Well, the Chinese Communist Party sees that as a threat. That's competition for them, because if you're serving Christ today, you're probably not serving the Communist Party. You're not serving their interests. And so sometimes it's a power struggle. It is just a battle for hearts and minds. And Christianity, the Bible, the gospel teaching is a threat in that battle for hearts and minds.
I think I read somewhere that some churches in communist China are forced to recite some communist creed at the start of their services.
Yes. And in the last few years, that has ratcheted up. It's like, hey, you used to sing Amazing Grace at the start of your service. We want you to sing Hail to the Communist Party at the start of your service. You used to say the Lord's Prayer. Now we want you to say something nice about Jinping, our president. And so that pressure is mounting in China, and they've just passed some new laws relating to foreigners being involved in any kind of religion or any kind of religious talk, and making it illegal as a foreigner to talk about religion, not just in front of a group of people like speaking in a church, but literally anywhere, anytime to talk about religion as a foreigner. That is now illegal in China. One of the other things that drives persecution, and this is especially true oftentimes in Islamic cultures, is the honor-shame culture. And oftentimes persecution starts with your own family. And it's a matter of, hey, we're a Muslim family, and now you say you're following Jesus. Well, we don't do that. You're not part of our family anymore if you do that. And also that brings shame on our family. As a dad, my neighbor or my fellow dads are going to say, how could you let your child leave Islam? What kind of dad are you that your son would be a follower of Jesus Christ? How terrible have you been as a father that would happen? So there's that shame that drives persecution as well. So sometimes it's power, sometimes it's shame, honor, shame culture. Often it's one of those two that is driving the mindset of the persecutors.
Just being honest, what you mentioned with the family and shame, that is my story to a T.
I have heard that is common in Jewish culture as well. As you come out of a Jewish family, it's like, what are you doing? How could you even grab a hold of that teaching and bring this shame on us?
Which they don't realize it's a fulfillment of Judaism. It's not
Right.
leaving it. It's the end of the story. And also with that, it made me think of the stories, and I think your most recent magazine issue about the Voodoo culture in Benin. There was a story about a Christian who was kicked out of his family because they said, well, you can't participate in our voodoo rituals anymore. You're not part of our culture anymore. And I mean, don't mess with voodoo. Well, that's terrifying.
Yeah.
We're going to stick a pin through your heart.
Yeah, it was such an eye opener, because we don't think of Benin as a place where like heavy persecution is happening. But one of the encouraging stories out of that magazine was they began to persecute the church because they realized when the church was meeting and praising the Lord and praying together, their spells didn't work. Like the magic was
Oh, yeah, I
broken by the
remember.
power of God. And that's why they attacked the church. It's like, hey, when you Christians are gathering and praying to your God, our spells don't work anymore. Now, you would hope, and hopefully they explain, well, that's because our God is more powerful than your spells. That's why we're worshiping him. But I was so encouraged by that. Like, they recognize there is a power when Christians gather. There is a power when they worship and when they pray. Even the enemies of the gospel recognize that power. And frankly, I think sometimes they recognize it more than we do. Like, we need to understand there's power in that as well.
I know the demonic realm is real, but these voodoo spells, I mean, do they really actually work? Could this have just been coincidence? Playing devil's advocate.
There are enough stories of the spell being cast and something terrible happening, even people dying. The thing that I take out of that is, boy, we don't want to mess with the demonic. Like there are some in America that think you can sort of play with that like it's a toy or it's a game or something. Boy, stay away from that stuff, because it does have power, and it's not the power of light, it's the power of darkness.
I just did an episode on whether Christians should celebrate Halloween, and that was like the number one reason of why not to. Don't mess with the demonic realm,
Don't mess
because
with it.
Ouija
Yep.
boards, I mean, you can actually be conjuring demons. You never know. Let's talk about how we can help here. How can we get involved? I mean, when you talked about the Nigerians, I just wanted to scoop up that family and adopt them right on the spot. But I'm serious.
I know my wife and I have the same conversation, so it's like, "Hey, we have a spare room. Let's. Um, one of the things, and I'll just respond to that real fast, but we don't want to pull the gospel out of Nigeria. One of the Voice of the Martyrs kind of bedrock things is sometimes we help people relocate within their country, like to a safer spot, but typically we don't help them get out of their country because we want the gospel to be there. We want there to be Christian lighthouses and Christian witnesses for Christ. And typically that's what they want too. It's like, Lord, help them to be faithful where they're at. They're not asking us to pray that they won't suffer anymore or that persecution will suddenly stop. They're asking us to pray, help me to be faithful in the midst of the suffering, in the midst of what is happening in my country. For those who are watching and listening, I always encourage, if this is your first contact with our persecuted brothers and sisters, this is maybe a new thing for you to hear about this, take 3 steps. The first one is I want you to commit to pray for our brothers and sisters who are suffering persecution. And that's not my request, that's their request. That's the first thing they ask us to do, is to pray for them. So make that commitment that, yes, I'm going to pray. I'm going to pray for persecuted Christians. And then the second step is to educate yourself so that you can pray more effectively. I love the prayer, God bless persecuted Christians, but I think it's easy not to pray that prayer because it's not very personal. It's not very connected. As you educate yourself, that prayer, God bless persecuted Christians, becomes God bless Pastor Wang Yi, who is serving 9 years in a Chinese prison right now. Bless his wife, Zhang Rong. Bless their son, Joshua. Sustain them today. Encourage them today. Keep them healthy today. Those prayers become much more personal as we educate ourselves so that we can pray more specifically. And Voice of the Martyrs has lots of tools to help you do that. We have a free monthly magazine. We have an app for your phone that has a new prayer request every single day. We have Voice of the Martyrs Radio, where I always ask that question, okay, how do we pray? So number 1, commit to pray. Number 2, educate yourself so that you can pray more effectively. And then I always tell people, step 3 is whatever God lays on your heart to do. Because as you're praying and as you're learning more, God's going to put his thumb on something and say, okay, now I want you to, and maybe that's going to be write letters to Christians who are in prison. Maybe it's going to be sponsor Bibles to be delivered to Christians in hostile areas and restricted nations. Maybe it's going to be get on an airplane and go to one of these countries and pray on the ground and meet Christians and encourage them face to face. But all of that is going to come as we're praying and as we're learning more. Then we just wait for God to say, okay, now step 3 for you is this. And then we just have to be obedient to what God is calling us to do.
So does VOM have resources and information on where to write letters, for example, like individual stories like that?
So prisoneralert.com, it gives you the address of the prison where the Christian's being held. It gives you the postage that you need to put on the envelope. So prisoneralert.com. And I'll tell just a quick story. I was just in Asia last month, and I met with the wife of a pastor who had been imprisoned in Central Asia. And he has since passed away. He's gone on to heaven. But she talked about during the 2 years that he was in prison, the custodian of the prison came to him one day and said, "You're getting boxes of mail. Like, you're getting letters from America and from Australia and from Europe. Like, why are all these people writing letters to you?" The guy never got to see the letters. Like, they never actually gave them to him. They never delivered them to him. But she said that was such an encouragement to him to know that people remembered him. He wasn't forgotten. And I was able to pull out my iPad and I actually showed her husband's page on the site. And I said, I know where some of those letters came from because we encourage people to write letters to your husband. And with tears streaming down her face, she said, "Thank you, thank you, thank you. You don't know what a difference that made for my husband. You don't know what an encouragement that was for him." And so I came back from that trip very motivated to tell people, hey, prisoneralert.com, go write a letter to Christians in prison. We don't know the difference it's going to make. We don't know how God's going to use those letters. And we have heard story after story after story where the prisoner, on a very practical, real level, they are treated better because it is assumed, like, if they're getting mail from America and all over the world, they must be important. Like, the rest of the world is watching how we treat this prisoner. We better make sure he survives. We better make sure he gets enough to eat because, look, the whole world is watching this. So prisoneralert.com, write letters to Christians in prison. It makes a difference.
And sometimes they do actually get to read the letters?
Sometimes they do. Yes, we've heard stories where they got the letters. We've heard stories where they don't get the letters. Almost always, though, they hear about the letters. One of my very favorites was from two ladies, Marzia and Mariam, who were imprisoned in Iran, and they never got to see the letters, but they tell the story that one day one of the guards asked them, they're like, "Do you realize how much trouble you're causing for us?" And these two sweet ladies are like, we're in jail. Like, how much trouble can we possibly be causing?
Right.
We're in jail. And the guard was like, "You are getting so much mail, and we have to read every single one of those letters, and that's causing us all kinds of extra work." And they smiled,
I
and
wonder if any of those guards became Christian after reading those letters.
I wonder that too. And I wonder if we'll hear in eternity that, yes, that happened because of those gospel seeds. They say, they smile like, if the letters are for us, you don't have to read them. You could just give them to us. We'll read them. They never got to see the letters, but that conversation so encouraged them that, yes, they were not forgotten. So story after story like that of just the difference of simply putting a letter in the mail and praying for the prisoner that you're writing to.
Speaking of praying for the persecuted, can you talk about November 2nd a little bit, what that day is all about?
Yes, November 2nd, International Day of Prayer for Persecuted Christians. And our hope is every single church praying for persecuted Christians on that Sunday. And it's, some churches will make it a part of their normal Sunday prayer time. Some churches will have a special extra prayer time for persecuted Christians. Some churches will go all out. We've heard from churches who do their own underground church service, and they meet in the basement that day, and they circulate a secret knock that you need to get in the door. And we've heard of churches that will, they'll have the sheriff come in and arrest the pastor in the middle of the service. And it's like, whoa, what's going on here? And then they get to say, well, our pastor's not really getting arrested, but there are pastors who are getting arrested today, and we need to pray for them. And we're going to do that right now. So different churches will handle it differently. But like I say, our hope is every single church is praying for persecuted Christians. And we have resources on the website, persecution.com, to help you pray. We have a video that illustrates the people we're praying for. It lets you put a name and a face to those that we're praying for. But every church praying for persecuted Christians, that's the point of IDOP Sunday, which is November the 2nd.
I wonder if any churches do the exercise about the communion. There's that incredible story about the Wormbrands when they were in prison and they had no bread, no wine, but they really wanted to hold communion. And so can you talk about that a little bit? I just love that story, how they did it out of nothing.
Honestly, I don't remember that story.
Oh, you don't remember that story?
I think you need to tell it. Yeah.
Okay, I won't do such a good job, but basically they said, we don't have anything. We don't have the bread, we don't have the wine, as I said, but we have nothing. And what is nothing? Nothing is something, because God created the world out of nothing. And so they used that as the premise, and then they just went from there and did this incredible, powerful communion prayer.
Wow.
Yeah, just the perspective that people get from being imprisoned for their faith. It's unbelievable.
I had a conversation with an American gospel worker who was imprisoned in the Middle East with 3 other Christians. And he talked about, the first few days, they were fearful. They were petrified. What's going to happen to us? How long is this going to last? Are they going to execute us? Like, what is going to happen? And he said on the 3rd or 4th day, they decided to have communion together in their cell. And they took their dry, crusty bread from their tray. And he said, we don't have wine, so they used water. And he kind of joked, Jesus turned water into wine, so that's not a problem for him. We can do that. When they had communion together on that day, he said it was like Jesus Christ himself walked into the prison cell and took away all their questions and all their worry and all their fear. He said it was such a powerful experience that the rest of their time in prison, they had communion together 3 times a day. Like 3 times a day they wanted to, and he said every single time it was like Jesus showed up, he was in the cell with us. And honestly, I think of that even at my own church when we take communion. I think of that story. Jesus, I want to experience your presence. I want you to walk in and take away my worry and take away my fear. And the power of inviting Christ's presence into our circumstance, into our situation. But I don't remember that story from the Worm Brands, but it reminds me of that story from our brother in the Middle East.
That's an incredible story. That gave me chills while you were talking about that. I like to end every episode by asking my interviewee to share a Bible verse. Obviously, there are so many in the New Testament about persecution. Is there one favorite of yours that just really stands out and has inspired you along your journey to share the stories of persecuted Christians?
Boy, there's a lot.
I
There's a
know.
lot.
Same.
Um, the one that comes immediately to my mind is the story of the apostles being taken before the Jewish council, and they were warned and they were beaten. And then it says they left the council rejoicing that they were counted worthy to suffer for the name of Christ. That idea of rejoicing in the midst of suffering is something that I have seen again and again and again in the persecuted brothers and sisters that I've gotten to interview. We hear the story of someone being beaten and we think, boy, they're probably really discouraged. They're probably wondering, how could God let this happen to them? And then you go and sit down with them and you say, okay, so how are you? And they're like, wow, look how faithful God is. And God was ministering to me in that room and he was with me. And then I got to tell this person about Christ and I got to tell this person about Christ. And they leave the room rejoicing that they were counted worthy to suffer for the name of Christ. And it really mirrors the experience of the apostles in Acts. And I hope that's an encouragement for us. If we are called to suffer for the name of Christ, God will show up in that. He promises that. He promises to give us the words to say when we stand before kings and authorities. He will tell us what to say. And then the idea that it's a compliment, it's a blessing from God if we are allowed, if we are considered worthy to suffer for the name of Christ. That is God's mark of favor on us. That's mind-blowing. And it's not a blessing any of us are praying for. Like, I'm not praying, Lord, I hope I can be beaten. I hope I can go to prison. But to see that as a blessing and to see that in the apostles and to see it in the persecuted believers of today, that's the verse that comes to mind.
Well, that is definitely a powerful note to end on. So, Todd Nettleton, thank you so much for joining us today. This was such an informative and inspiring conversation.
Well, thank you for having me. I love telling the stories of the brothers and sisters that I've met, and so this is a great opportunity for me.
And thanks to all of you, our awesome listeners, for tuning in. Your support means so much. So if you enjoyed today's conversation, be sure to subscribe and leave a review wherever you get your podcasts. Stay inspired, keep trusting in God's plan for your life, and we'll see you next time.